So the purpose of this session is, obviously you've all been engaged in different conversations. So here on the stage I have the 4 facilitators and chairs from the 4 separate sessions. So what we've asked them to do is just to take 5 minutes each to share with you what their highlights and insights from their sessions were. And hopefully that will leave us a few minutes at the end just to have a bit of a conversation of whether there were any common themes that came out across the 4 topics. So I'm going to ask Isabella first to share with us the conversation you had with all the Drucker Challenge essay colleagues. So over to you. No, to Isabella.
Thank you very much. A warm welcome. We had a bar camp session the first time with the Drucker Challenge winners, and we had it in a real theater. So everyone who did not participate seriously missed out on a first-timer on the Global Peter Drucker Forum. We tried with this year's topic, growth and inclusive prosperity, to apply exactly that. So we tried to be inclusive, and with the bar camp, you include new speakers, young generation, and you include the audience. So, and that went in such a fashion that we had our Drucker Challenge winners and finalists first pitch their topic idea, because we started without a program. We didn't have any agenda, and you start from scratch, and we started with pitches, and then the audience was asked from the pitches that were given to vote what they would like to hear. So we had the voting, and it was clear in the first round, not like with general elections elsewhere in the world where you need 2 or 3 goes. We did it in 1 go, and came up with 5 extremely interesting topics. And I want to read them to you. The first one was given by Antoine, and she had the topic of antiquated innovation, which is maybe a bit difficult as a topic, and she started reframing it with drones or falcons, and asked whether we can't go back to do the simple things and not start doing everything thinking tech first, like maybe think practical first. And the second talk was given by Ali Rustan Tariq, and he just asked one very simple question: can we cultivate compassion in our organizations? And this might lead to next year's topic. I won't say any more, but he argued that maybe with all the tech, we forget that still, even if robots move in, compassion will rule and will create engagement. Then we had another 3 very interesting topics. The first one of the next 3 that were voted in, the first 2 ones were our Drucker Challenge winners of the 2 streams, the students category and the managers category. And then came 3 from the finalists. The first next topic is humans will take over. What happens to the robots then? Exactly. The next one was, what is a LinkedIn going to look like for a plumber in Africa? So like a LinkedIn for the linked out. Very interesting discussion. How do you collaborate if you don't have access to opportunity? Like this was another topic that revolved all around all the sessions. And the 5th topic, extremely interesting also, was how do we make competition extinct? Argued in such a way that we could consider and ponder, how do we spend so much in trying to annihilate our competition, and what could we have developed and co-created if we hadn't tried to evacuate our competition from the field. So what we try to do is, seeing that I'm running out of time, is to, what has been said yesterday, growth happens when there is access to opportunity. So we gave opportunity, and the type of opportunity is one that may also result in some heavy CV writing, because 5 new generation and next generation managers had the opportunity to rewrite their CVs with giving a talk at the Global Peter Drucker Forum. So, Grant.
Thank you, Isabella. That sounds like a really stimulating session. Thank you. If we have a couple of minutes at the end, we'll perhaps pick up on any of the themes. But Tony, you had a conversation in here around the shifts in education. So what were the key things that came out of it for you?
I just have to say that Isabella's presentation reminds me why I love being a professor. It's there's no monopoly on great ideas. It doesn't tie to age. And sometimes you sit in the classroom, you say LinkedIn for the linked out, or these kind of just very nice, fresh framings of opportunity. And so those of us who sit in the academy, we asked ourselves during this panel, look, if we're living in a world of paradox, thanks to Charles Handy for introducing that whole notion to us, in a world where we're digitally connected, but we're paradoxically more polarized than we ever have been before. We're more digitally connected, but we're more, organizations are less stable and institutions are less stable than they've ever been before. And when you have polarity and instability, where do we go? Well, we go to leadership. We look to leadership to kind of take us into the breach of uncertainty and hopefully out to somewhere better on the other side. And so our question was, well, what does that mean for those of us who are supposed to develop leaders? Question number one, what does leadership mean in this particular context that we've been discussing for the last day or two? And how do we focus it on inclusive prosperity? Question number two, if we can define what that is, how might we think differently about developing leadership capability at the pace and scale that's required today? And question number three was, if those two are shifting, how might that inform how we think about conducting research into the practice of leadership so that we can achieve more scale in getting what we know to be true about leadership out? Very, very small and simple topic. As Richard and I were thinking about putting this together, we basically framed this as the opening chapter of a book yet to be written. And our goal was only to surface the questions that we thought would merit further inquiry. We don't pretend to have an answer here, but we know that we have a set of issues. So what we did was we thought that we would lean into our own experience. Everybody on the stage is a leader, and they're dealing with complexity. And so they shared the challenges and struggles they're facing and the tensions that they have to deal with as leaders. They happen to be leaders of educational institutions, but what does it feel like to be a leader today? And I think the consensus is it really sucks. And it's really lonely. And it's really challenging. And that there's a lot of insecurity in leadership today. That the imposter syndrome is alive and well and moving around. And yet leaders feel additional burden of responsibility because of the position they hold, but perhaps not the confidence to execute because they don't feel that they know what to do. I have the great benefit of speaking with leaders all the time in my role, and I met with a very senior leader a couple of weeks ago, and he said, I really know my experience counts for something, I just don't know which part. And if I lean into the wrong part of my prior experience, I might actually get something wrong. And the decision I make, which is something Roger, I think, talked about in the very first panel here, will have very, very significant consequence. And the panel this morning about strategy and the choices you make, it's very, very important. So what do we do about it as educators? Santiago, president of IE University, said, let's go back to basics and think about the humanities. And also, let's have corporate leaders step up and take more accountability beyond shareholder value, and used a very provocative example of how 2,000 businesses left Catalonia as a statement of what they thought about the particular situation, and that sent a message to both political sides in Spain. And so that there's more agency for corporate leaders today, and they have to step up to that responsibility. Julia talked a lot about taking Peter Drucker's philosophy and bringing it to China in a practice-based way. It's not about the theory, it's about going out there and doing it. And she just casually mentioned that since they started in 1999, they've had 50,000 managers come through their doors. I quickly did the math, that's 1 million people Duke my university, Fuqua School of Business, has only got 20,000 alumni. So there's scale, and there's practice, and there's the human practice. HICO was very much about, you're not giving me the capability I need. You need to have much more sensitive leaders who understand the soft aspects of getting work done, not just the technical aspects. And Johan was very much of the same perspective that said we have to really think differently. We have to hold on to the things we really value about the academy, like introspection and digging into what's going on, but we have to get it out much faster and in the context that executives need. So that's the short story on a very long conversation that we're just beginning.
Thank you, Tony. And then, very often at conferences like these, we spend a lot of the examples that we're given are from the private sector, and so it's great to hear from Timo, because there was a conversation about public value in terms of the conversation that you were having. So interested to hear what some of the insights were.
Yes, our session could have lasted even another hour. We started earlier and we finished late. There was lots of energy in the room, not just because we talked about Peter Drucker, but also about Mark Twain. Maybe one Drucker rule we disobeyed, which was what's going to be done on Monday morning. We were strong enough not to jump too early to conclusions. And maybe to summarize our session, it's this old saying, being confused, but on a higher level maybe. Still confused, but on a higher level. We discussed a lot of different perspectives, and let me walk you through a little bit what actually happened in our session. Of course, first starting by saying Drucker said it all, and he really did, sometimes not, and we have to translate. But as early as in his 1994 book, The Future of Industrial Man, he strongly argued in his social theory that every organization has a social function. It's not a moral impetus, it's quite an idea how the social networks, how the social fabric works, and therefore organizations, whether they like it or not, in parentheses, Drucker always strongly opposed CSR for very good reasons. He strongly opposed CSR because he referred more fundamentally to the notion of serving, of contributing, serving the public interest, the common good. And here we are. Public value is a kind of Drucker's coming home in a way, translating Drucker's idea of contributing to society by introducing the narrative, as we say today, the concept of public value. I remember very well a couple of years ago at this forum, we had Mark Kramer, colleague of Michael Porter, telling us a lot about shared value. And the question in our panel was, what's different this time? What might be the European roots of this concept related to Aristotelian idea of the common good, making it productive for modern times? And we started off by a very interesting speech by Julie Teichlen, the regional managing partner of EY for Germany, Switzerland, and Austria. And Julie introduced the two most important days in one's life by referring to Mark Twain. The first one is when you were born. The second one is when you discover why. And actually, our whole session was about the why question, the deeper why, the more fundamental why. Not just at the individual level, but the collective or the corporate level. And Julie made the case why EY engages not just in tech line, building a better working world, but in the services on this purpose-related advisory for a number of reasons. Disruption, digitalization, but also justifying the means of production in a capitalist society as a way of necessity. We went on with Virginie Coe-Ledon's NGO established recently in Berlin, talking about how an NGO can instill the thinking with a strong need to foster collaboration by also measuring in terms of making transparent public value benchmarks. These days we can already show a strong correlation with S&P 500 companies' stock performance and public value index. It's measurable. We also went on with Mr. Brüller. You see all of us on the upper left, Franz Karl Brüller. He talked about the traditions in the Erste Bank and the Savings Bank of Austria, how the notion of social purpose has been evolving over time since more than almost 200 years, that it's built in this kind of European institutional context. sometimes moving, wandering around, but still being a kind of a North Star. This was a metaphor in our discussion. And then we also had a very interesting input by Mr. Holzwart, Ralf Holzwart. He's the CEO of the Bulgarian Labor Agency, Federal Labor Agency in Germany. And he was talking about the question how a bureaucracy obeyed by law is not simply acknowledged by just following the law, but as public value has to be earned, has also to include this type of outside-in perspective. And in a way, to make it a common denominator, we struggled with examples, with practice, but we had this kind of narrative, to use this word. But the remaining question is, what's different this time? We not just had trucker, we have porter, we have public value. What's different this time? It's a burning question. It's not an easy question. And my take is, to summarize, and I see that the clock is burning down. It's not just a matter of defense and risk avoiding. In my lecturing with students, I see a growing, it's not just Generation Y and millennials take, a growing need to make public value sexy. I use the word in a positive way. It's not just defending the order, it's being part and contribute to making the order, to change the world a little bit. And the Elon Musks and Zuckerbergs and all the guys from Silicon Valley, they use this narrative to motivate people, and it's very motivating to see that it really motivates if you relate your purpose, which is not charity, ladies and gentlemen, it's strongly based on a profit motive, but if you relate your purpose to a public value narrative.
I think
this is, maybe I should stop here because...
But I think also what you're saying is being really clear if you're going to keep some parts of this, which bits are going to create value. So perhaps we'll come back to that. But I want to give Andreas the chance because you picked up the theme, particularly around Central and Eastern Europe and how this inclusive prosperity plays out in those parts of the market. So interesting to hear the summary of your points. And then if we have some time, we'll pick up on some of the questions. So.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Timo has used up 2/3 of my time, so I will be very brief.
You're fine. You've got your 5 minutes.
I'm not worried about it. Thank you for having the opportunity to lead this panel on inclusive prosperity in Eastern and Central Europe. We were a panel of 2 Frenchmen and 2 Austrians talking about Eastern Europe, which, Richard, I have to say, got us some criticism from the audience since there was no representative and we had the outside look in. However, I think we had a good debate about GDP per capita in Eastern Europe in the last 20 years, rapidly growing, however, still being significantly lower than in the rest of Europe. We started out talking about that and the expectation that in the next decade, there is an expectation that none of the Eastern European countries will get to the GDP per capita compared to the average in the EU. There's obviously has been, I would say, 3 regions within Central and Eastern Europe which have quite different speed in development. The Central Eastern European countries which have much quicker caught up or tried to catch up. The Southern European Eastern countries which are by far still on a much lower GDP per capita level, and then the far Eastern European countries with Russia, Ukraine, where obviously through the political situation things are much more difficult. Interestingly enough, in 2016 was a peak year in M&A transactions into the Central and Eastern European markets. So after the initial euphoria after the change 20 years ago, it got a little bit more quiet, but now it seems that there is a raised interest again to invest and develop those markets, predominantly European, but as of late also Chinese investors who are moving in. And that brings together that the gap in prosperity is obviously narrowing down. We then discussed the main challenges of the panel, we think, in this development, and identified a number of them. The biggest one is to close the education gap and to help to develop the human resources in Central Eastern Europe, because as we are all businessmen on this panel, for all of us, the biggest challenge holding back us as companies prospering and growing faster in Eastern Europe is the lack of human skills and the lack of people we can employ there. The second big challenge was identified in the social welfare systems in the Central Eastern European countries, unfunded pension plans, etc. going forward. The third one, the need to develop capital markets to supply capital, particularly to startups, but also to new companies. And last but not least, of course, political stability. We talked a little bit about the situation in Russia, in the Ukraine, and the urgent need to get this resolved if those markets want to continue to develop their prosperity. So overall, I think there was a very positive and optimistic spirit in the discussion, that the development is good. It has picked up again in the last recent present. However, there was some critical voices from our participants in terms of focus on the cost difference to make those economies still very competitive in Europe, in terms of only focusing on low-cost issues rather than creating high-tech jobs. But overall, I think there was a very positive spirit that we all expect these Eastern European countries to have quite a prosperous future.
Okay, thank you. As you were talking, it just occurred to me that we heard yesterday as well this issue around lack of education, lack of skills, and in a broader sense than maybe the conversation that your group had around leadership. So often executive education tends to focus on the leadership, but what we heard yesterday from Joseph, I think, and we're hearing from you as well, which is there's a broader entry-level set of skill sets that we're needing, which has just occurred to me. Good.
Heiko talked about that as well, that said there's a capability gap, and that capability can be technical or leadership, and both are capability gaps.
And I think what's the role of, and we heard yesterday, state, but also corporations in terms of plugging that. Brilliant. Well, I'm not even going to attempt to summarize themes across those four, given they were so different and so diverse, but thank you so much. Sounds like you had very rich conversations. I'm conscious that we've got a full program ahead of us this afternoon, so I just want to do some signposting for you. A number of you have asked whether we are doing book signings. We have so many distinguished authors here. Trying to do that in a formal way would have been very difficult. However, if you would like to go to where the books are laid out down on the ground floor, from 15 minutes before we restart, any authors who are willing to sign their books will be hanging around and will be willing to sign copies of their books for you. So any of you who've asked me about that, if you go down there at the end of lunchtime, that would be possible. The other thing to say is we've got a full program through till 5 o'clock this afternoon. And I just want to signal we've got some very important announcements right at the end of the day that Richard's going to share with us. So any of you want to know what that is, don't disappear too early, because they're going to be coming at the end of the day. We'll be back in here for another plenary session. There were some technical issues this morning with Slido. We hope we've now sorted those out. So if any questions have bubbled up during this morning's session that you want any of our panels to pick up this afternoon, please do pop those in over lunch. We'll be starting back in here at 1 o'clock with the next plenary. Lunch is back down where we were yesterday lunchtime. Enjoy your lunch.